I don't know how many of you are familiar with the writings of Jacques Ellul, a French, obviously, philosopher. I have been often encouraged, maybe not by everything he says, but in his book, The Presence of the Kingdom, he says that in my view today we're called to nothing less than the recognition of the fact that we need above all to understand, and the strategy of the devil is using to neutralize the gospel. Now you might have heard something about that in the previous lecture, although it wasn't called the strategy of the devil. Unless we see this clearly. And then he goes on to say, he said, we need to find, if we want to go further, we must find either a door or we must break down the wall. But first, we must investigate this wall in order to find whether there is a door. Thus, we need to explore the world in which we are living. If there is no door, which he says, it seems to me, be the case, then we must find or create the instruments we need in order to make a breach in it. So I think we are all pretty well aware of the difficulties we're facing in the Western world with respect to presenting the gospel. It's not simply the matter that we are Christian, it's really the matter that we are considering the matter of truth. And that's quite obnoxious to many in our cultures today. Why? Because the Western cultures are not being constructed on truth. In fact, we are told there is no truth. In an article that appeared by Andrew Sullivan in The Intelligencer, just I think back in December, he says, seduced by scientism, distracted by materialism, insulated like no human beings before us from the vicissitudes of sickness and the ubiquity of early death. I'm so encouraged that I'm now being told that I have a good chance to live to almost 100, according to statistics. So I don't know if that's a good or bad, but I'm taking it as a good thing. He says, we have leveraged science for our own health and comfort, but the banality of the God of progress, which is a key idea, the idea that the best life is writing explanators for Vox that's a magazine, in order to make the world a better place, never quite slacks the thirst for something deeper. Liberalism is a set of procedures with an empty center, not a manifestation of truth, let alone a reconciliation to morality. A good summary. I notice that more and more people are talking about a post-Christian as in contradistinction to post-modernity. I think post-modernity is the most ridiculous term I have ever heard. It tells us nothing about the thought form. Really what post-modernity is anti-modernity. But be that as it may, how do we, as it were, break through the wall or construct instruments to do such? And I'm looking at the reality in the Apologetics of Lewis and Schaeffer. Because our vision of reality determines how we view everything. A man by the name of Tyson, he's Australian, I believe, maybe South African. He says, every time we plan or perform an activity in what we take to be a realistic manner, we do so by putting our confidence in a set of deeply held beliefs about the nature of reality. In other words, most women who go about their housekeeping duties, or men if they're doing it, they very seldom think that there are pink fairies that come along at night and do the laundry, because that's not the reality we live in. And we shape our lives according to the reality we live in. A change in a vision of reality, and that's what's happened in the Western world over the last 30 years at least, makes a change in how men think, which influences apologetics. So we have been moving from a more of a theistic vision of reality to a naturalistic vision of reality. Naturalism is the accepted vision of reality by most post-Christian world. And this has created an intellectual wall against the gospel. For it doesn't make sense to talk about a God and to talk about a vision of reality that has the notion of transcendent universals if the total understanding of our world is totally within a frame of naturalism. Everything above experience today is being denied. I think about Richard Weaver, who wrote his book in the 1948, Ideas Have Consequences, in which he says, this is 1948, and he's saying, listen, we're denying anything that is above experience. He said, ultimately that will mean relativism, where man is the measure of all things. He was quite prophetic. Reality then in the Apologetics of Schaeffer. Lewis and Schaeffer had one thing or some things in common. One is that they both were engaged in an environment, an intellectual environment, that was shaped by naturalism in different ways. Lewis, in the UK primarily, was atheism, and yet Schaeffer dealt with existentialism. But both were, in reality, a denial of what we call metaphysical reality. Now, that's a word that we just would explain. A metaphysical realist simply says that the objects in our world exist independent of our thought and have natures that determine their existence. In other words, we understand from a Christian vision of reality, we understand who you are, not by your function, but by your nature, because we believe there are essences. You say, well, that sounds awful Platonic. Excuse me, I'm sorry that it sounds very Platonic, but there's nothing wrong with that as far as I can see. Today, your worth, according to a naturalistic worldview, is functionalistic. It is what you do determines who you are. And often it's cashed out in what we call economic terms. How is it that we should open up something to this world? Schaeffer said, Plato understood that you have to have absolutes. Don't say that word around, because we all know that absolutes don't exist. Oh, I see. That's not an absolute? That absolutes don't exist. Sounds kind of absolute to me. But the difficulty facing Plato, and this is where Schaeffer understood, that Plato did not have a God large enough to handle the job he had to do. And Lewis is going to say something very similar to that. Lewis shows his commitment in his writings to metaphysical realism. If you remember, in the last battle of Lord Diggory is explaining why the new Narnia looked something so much like the old Narnia, only just brighter and richer, more wondrous, he claimed. Oh, that old Narnia that mattered, all that dear creatures have been drawn into the real Narnia through the door, and of course, it's different. As a real thing is from a shadow. That's very Platonic thinking. And then he's talking, and he says, as walking life is from a dream. And after he added under his breath, it's all in Plato. This is Lewis talking. It's all in Plato. All in Plato. Bless me, what do they teach these children at school today? Well, that's exactly maybe many of us are asking. Also, you can see his writings in The Abolition of Man and Mere Christianity. And in reflection of the Psalms, Lewis claims that Plato got very close to the Christian tradition in the matter of God in creation. However, as you know, Plato nor Aristotle believed in creation ex nihilo. And that would be the one piece that Christianity would bring into this idea, and that is that in the beginning God created, and he creates ex nihilo. Now, why is it so important to have this notion of metaphysical realism? There's a realism that's transcendent, that on which the physical world is mapped. According to Lewis, naturalism left us as post-Christian and not pagans. Lewis, in a number of his letters, he talks about this, but in early 1940s, Lewis preached a sermon. It was a Christmas sermon on pagans. And Lewis said, well, at least with a pagan had the idea that there was something above nature. He said the post-Christian has no belief that there's anything above nature. And so Lewis said, I'm not even sure there are any pagans left. By that meaning people who believed in some form of the supernatural. He said the pagan, he was religious. Oh, of course, it wasn't a very helpful way, but he was religion. He believed in an objective right and wrong, the law written on the heart. And they believed that they were morally guilty, although they had silly ways to deal with it. And this all came out of a Christmas sermon for pagans, 1946. And his pointing out is simply this, that post-Christians have no vision of anything, any reality above experience. Everything has to be determined. Now, here we are as Christians, and we're supposed to give out the message of Christ, and there's a God who sent his Son. Now, how do we speak of that truth in a world that is so framed by naturalism? In a sense, the pagan, Lewis tells us, was a metaphysical realist. He just got the metaphysical ordering wrong. He didn't really know it well, but we as Christians do. Now, it was Lewis's view and Schaeffer's view of what we call metaphysical realism, that there was something that was real, objectively real, that didn't change with the flow of time. It was always there, objective reality. And that shaped their apologetics. And that's why I think both Lewis and Schaeffer give us examples to follow in doing our evangelism today. The fact is, we do not bend reality to fit us. Reality bends us to fit it. Lewis used to say, if you're going to build an airplane, you can't build it any way you want. You've got to build it the way the world is. How did that help them? I would suggest, along with Lewis and Schaeffer, we always begin with reality, the way things are. That is because that's where we all have to live. Now, just as a preview of coming attractions, when we are engaged in truth-telling to the naturalist, however that works out, we will give our beliefs. Now, if we do that, and there's nothing wrong with that, but you will notice if the other person says, I don't believe that, and now it's a battle of my beliefs against your beliefs. That often is a very hard path to go. However, if you have the unbeliever put his beliefs up against reality and allow reality to judge his beliefs first, Lewis is going to say, show a person first that he is wrong, and then show him why he is wrong. This was pre-evangelism. Show a man that he does not live consistently in this reality. There's only one reality, no matter what New Age people may think and all the rest of it. I always kind of smile when people are debating with me and they want to say, reality is in your mind. But it's just very funny to me that when we leave the room, they all go through the same door. I mean, why not just choose your way? I mean, go any way you want to go if reality is in the mind, which of course it's not. Those are sort of things that people talk about because they think it sounds interesting. His naturalistic beliefs or his longings do not match up with the way the world is. Christianity is about truth and reality, the truth of things, the truth of the way things are. From their understanding of reality came their apologetic approach, which was called pre-evangelism. In fact, I believe that Lewis uses the word pre-evangelism before Schaeffer did, and it came from one of the church fathers. Realism was what they considered to be the foundation of their pre-evangelism, that there is this reality that's independent of our minds, which our beliefs about this world could be measured for truth value, which I think is something for us to consider. For Lewis, reality not only says something about the world, but also about man. He points out that when we say a shoe fits, he says, well, we're saying something more than about the shoe. We're also saying something about the foot. And I think that's a clever way of Lewis. I mean, isn't he the clever one? And to be able to say something just like that. I just wished I had a tad of that brilliance. For Schaeffer will say something very similar. He said the truth of Christianity is that it's true to what is there. You can go to the end of the world and never need to be afraid, like the ancients, that you'd fall off at the end and the dragons will eat you up. You can carry out your intellectual discussion to the end of discussion because Christianity is not only true to dogma, it is true to what is there. And you will never fall off the end of the earth. I think, yes. So we can push beliefs up against the reality to see whether or not this belief has any truth value or not. Beginning with their view of reality, they formed what each referred to as this pre-evangelism. So that's before you get to giving the gospel. You prepare people to realize that the reason they need the gospel is that their thinking is wrong. They have a wrong vision of reality. Like Schaeffer, Lewis believed that reality is a great teacher. Schaeffer reminded us this means that we do not first try to move a man away from his logical conclusions of his presupposition, but towards them. Oh, this is what you believe? Good. Then let's put it up against the way you live. Let's see if this is really how you live. First showing the person that he is wrong before why he is wrong. Schaeffer was certain that any non-Christian vision of reality would fail at the end when carried out to its logical conclusion. Now that's not being arrogant, at all. Not that we necessarily say it to the unbeliever, but it is the truth of things because this is the reality in which we live. How do we explain this or that? I was speaking with a young lady who was interviewing me in a post-Soviet country, and as we were walking out in the garden to be interviewed, she wanted to know why we suffered so much. And so my question was to her, why do you think things should be any different than they really are? Why do you long for a time of peace? And she didn't have an answer. Of course she didn't. But then I said, do you suppose it's because that's what we were created for? That's why we're longing for it? There's something that's not quite right? Now, what would be our explanation for that? For Schaeffer, bringing this person to the logical conclusions of their own presuppositions was to bring a person to the point of what he called crisis. Lewis says, what I like about experience is it's such an honest thing. Why, you may take any number of wrong turns, but keep your eyes open, and you will not be allowed to go very far before the warning signs appear. You may have deceived yourself, but experience is not trying to deceive you. The universe rings true wherever you fairly test it. And that's the test. Will I fairly test it? So the reality of this world was used to show that she was wrong. And this was referred to as pre-evangelism. Lewis writes, for my part, I believe we ought to work not only at spreading the gospel, that certainly, but also at a certain preparation for the gospel. It's necessary to recall many of the law of nature before we talk about God, for Christ promises forgiveness of sin, but what is that to those who, since they don't know the law of nature, do not know they have sinned? This is in the letter that he writes to Giovanni. Is that not so? If we talk about people needing to know Jesus, but if we jump in the middle of the story, why should they think they need to know about Jesus when they don't even know that there's a God who has a son that God could send, and to send to save them from their sin when they think they have not sinned? See, there's no way that makes sense. So what Schaeffer and Lewis thought we should do is to start with a person's beliefs where they were, and rather than argue my belief against his belief, we would say, let's put your belief up against reality. Now, certainly, sooner or later, we have to defend our beliefs. I'm not suggesting we shouldn't. In a letter to Sister Penelope, speaking of his radio talks to the RAF, Lewis explains, mine are the preparing of the gospel rather than the evangelism, an attempt to convince people that there is a moral law, that we disobey it, and the existence of a lawgiver is at least very probable, and also, unless you add the Christian doctrine of atonement, imparts despair rather than comfort. Both Lewis and Schaeffer felt that pre-evangelism would bring about a sense of despair. That what should I do then? It's kind of like the Philippian jailer. That came before we gave the good news. Why should I need the good news if I'm satisfied with what I have? Schaeffer reviewed pre-evangelism as no soft option. He says every man has built a roof over his head to shield himself at the point of tension, and the person is not in a place of consistency with his system, and a roof built is a protection against the blows of the real world, both internal and external. The Christian lovingly must remove the shelter and allow the truth of the external world and of what man is to beat upon him. When the roof is off, each man must stand naked and wounded before the truth of the gospel. That there was sort of the despair before there came the truth, so to speak, the good news. But remember, Schaeffer says, you do this in a loving way. You're not just trying to destroy somebody. And he says that not just the external, it's also the internal. Why is it that we have longings for certain things that Lewis will make a lot of? Why do we have longing for beauty? Why do we have longing for the good? Why do we have longing for meaning? That cannot be explained in a naturalistic environment. The truth that we let in first is not some dogmatic truth of the Scriptures, but the truth of the external world and the truth of what man is himself. This is what shows him his need, and the Scriptures then show him the real nature of his lostness and the answer for it. This leads to an understanding of guilt, which Schaeffer says, I don't mean by guilt that I feel guilty, I have guilty feelings. He said, what I'm talking about is that you sense you have a real moral guilt before God. And we don't like to talk in those terms so much anymore. We want to make everybody feel good. But to bring a person face to face with a true moral guilt before a judge. Secondly, he, that is the unbeliever, needs to bow in the realm of morals, that is, to the knowledge that he has sinned and therefore that he has guilt before God. It's the same thing that Lewis is saying. That is, man must know that there is some kind of a moral law. Schaeffer on the condition of unbeliever. He said they're not able to believe there is a God. They don't believe there is an absolute. There is no reason for them to think of themselves as a sinner. This is just so that there's only a sickness. So the words we use in order to talk to the unbeliever are very important. We must not borrow the words of culture to talk about sin in our world. We must use the words that are appropriate. We like to use the word sickness because if sickness or disease, then you see in that sense there must be a pill or something to fix it. Rather, if we talk about, and it's a hard thing to say, I suppose, that the idea of sin, that we've against a God. In this sense, pre-evangelism brings despair rather than comfort at first. It leads to an understanding of guilt. Schaeffer writes, guilt does not mean to have guilty feelings. Oh, I'm sorry. I went up. As Schaeffer pointed out, the truth of Christianity is that it's true to what is there. In a world of naturalism, which has led to relativism, there is no sense, or there's little sense, that there is something that is objective, that is outside the mind, that we kind of get to make it up ourselves. But we can't really live that way. Both Lewis and Schaeffer would say, no, you can't live that way. So before we get to the gospel, maybe what we'll have to do is to show a person that their vision of reality is simply not correct. And I'll show that to them not by bringing my beliefs against their beliefs. I'll show them this by gently allowing them to see how their beliefs stack up against reality, the reality we all live in. Now, once a person says, oh my, I think there's a problem, then we come with the gospel that defines the problem as well as a solution. Now, I realize that we have different ways that people have of dealing with the unbeliever. I'm not saying that this is the only way you get to it. But I do think it is, I was going to say, an effective. Well, I don't know what that would mean. But I do think it is a way in which we can, as Al-Yul wants to say, is that we find a way to break the wall, to breach it, And we do that, the wall that we have to breach is this naturalism that is so incompatible with theism. Schaeffer pointed out that the truth of Christianity is that it's true to what is there. That's why we do not have to be ashamed or afraid. And I say that quickly, but I really mean it. When I lecture in universities, particularly throughout Eastern Europe, one can have a confidence, and I don't mean an arrogance, I mean a confidence, that the truth of Christianity will answer the question of the heart of man, however that question is formed. And as Lewis had said, it just rings true to whatever is there if you fairly test it. And that's what we do in pre-evangelism. We help a person in a gentle way to, as it were, to test their beliefs against the reality in which they live. Not just the external reality, but the reality of who man is himself. Why do we cry out for things? Why do we cry out for freedom? Why is it that we want freedom? It's not something we create. Freedom is something that every human being is born with the notion that is something that you want. I'm amazed when you think about children. What are some of the first questions children ask? Now, if you're a parent, you will know what some of those questions are. One of them is, Mommy. They always ask Mom, Mommy, where did I come from? Now, no parent in their right mind ever started teaching this little thing they brought home from the hospital. Now, the first question I want you to ask is where you came from. Of course not. But isn't it amazing that it's one of the first questions children ask? And then you have to say, why? How is it that a 3-year-old understands that they are a contingent being, that did not create they did not create themselves? So the next thing to think is, who did create me? Well, Mommy must have. Yeah, but then that leads to another question. Well, where did Mommy come from? And you know how long that discussion can go. So the wise parent says, gets right to the heart of it. Adam and Eve. But of course that still leaves the question, where did Adam and Eve come? And then the child will ask another question. Well, where did God come from? At which time, the parent simply says, it's time for you to go and play. But the fact of the matter is, God doesn't come from anywhere, because he always was. Now, how do we explain those are the questions that come out of a 3-year-old? When nobody taught them. He says, Schaeffer says, pre-evangelism did not begin by arguing with a non-Christian about her view of truth. Instead, begin with her view of reality. Metaphysics, which is the study of the nature of reality. We just don't talk about that much in our churches. Oh, it's too deep. Oh, we wouldn't want to talk about things like that. And yet, where does the Bible begin? Genesis, which informs us on what? The nature of the world we live in. And yet, we want to use Genesis only to fight off the evolutionist. But we don't see how important. Why is it that the Bible, our Bible, begins with Genesis? An instruction on the nature of reality. Because if you don't have that, things like incarnation, virgin birth, resurrection really don't make a whole lot of sense. Beginning with their view of reality and hence her beliefs, pre-evangelism helps place her beliefs against reality itself to see if they ring true to what is. This was not just reality in the physical world, but as I've said also, the moral structure. Why do we say you shouldn't do that? That's not fair. Why do we say those sort of things? Why do we have this notion that there's a right and a wrong, even if we violate that notion? According to Schaeffer, the Christian should then lovingly push the non-Christian, until she could see that her beliefs did not fit either with herself or with her world. One could begin with reality and then move to the truth of Christianity. Pre-evangelism was grounded in what I've simply called metaphysical realism. I know that's more of a philosophical term, but you can understand the concept. That is, that there is this reality, but this is not all there is to reality. There is something above this, which we call the metaphysical world, the transcendent, and that this reality is only properly understood when it's understood in light of the reality above experience. Objects in our world exist independently of our thought. We don't create our own reality, do we? We would like to, but we can't. Children try to, right? And we fool ourselves at times, thinking we can do it. Independently of our thought, and have natures that determine their existence, everybody must live in this reality. And I'm not sure why we don't make more of that as Christians. After all, if the Christian truth claims are right, then it should be a good test. If this world is created by God, then there ought to be some correspondence between my beliefs and the way the world is. The purpose of removing the roof simply brings, using Schaeffer's term, simply brings discomfort to find the door or the opening through which to minister the gospel, where somebody says, my beliefs aren't working for me. Now, this sometimes happens in another way. You will notice, is it not so, that you will find that sometimes when people go through a real deep crisis, they will then sometimes realize that their belief system is not sufficient to get them through the day. And then at that time, they will then turn. Now, I was a pastor for 30 years. And you would realize that sometimes there was death in the family or a tragedy in the family, something like that. You would find that people were more open to talk about spiritual things than they were the day before. And why is that? Well, it's because their beliefs have been challenged. They've been challenged by their personal experience. But there are times when we just can't wait for some personal experience to come in a person's life and say, now I'll come talk to you about the gospel. No, if we follow sort of the Lewis and Schaeffer model or example, then we say we must help the person in a kind and compassionate way to see the fact that the beliefs do not match up. To show a person is wrong before telling him why. Their apologetic was not formed by the winds of culture, but by the truth of things. I hear people say, well, what could we learn about postmodernity to help with a Christian message? And I'm saying, why are you mucking around in that? It has nothing to say because it denies the very reality we believe. Let's just stay with where we are. Their apologetic was not formed then, but by the created reality. It did not begin with some dogmatic statement from Scripture. Now, there was a time when you could actually do that, at least in America. There was a time when you could really begin with a statement about God, Christ, and people had an idea of what you were saying. They might not have believed it personally, but they didn't understand what you were saying. That's not true anymore, unfortunately. So we think we're being very true to the gospel when we say, Christ died for your sins in the beginning of the conversation. And then just looking around at us and saying, huh? What sin? I think I'm doing okay. That's because of their worldview or their vision of reality. This placed the beliefs of the non-Christian against the reality in which she lived, not against the Christian belief. That's taken a relief from me. As I engage unbelievers, I know we as Christians, we really want to tell the unbeliever all we know. I mean, we are pretty smart people. But the good words that we say often just bounce off them because we're speaking against a wall. Good words, no doubt about that. Upon showing a person he's wrong, then the gospel comes and tells why he is wrong. There are good and sufficient reasons to believe that Christianity is true. It's not something that we've manufactured. When I say it is true, I would agree with Schaeffer and Lewis. The Christian message is true to what is. I don't have to make that up. That's just out here for all of us to see. So I would, at least I submit, as a possibility of, for those of you who might consider pre-evangelism, that it would be done in this fashion, whereas we allow the beliefs of the unbeliever to be measured up against the reality in which we live, to see, or to let the individual see, does that belief square with the reality in which I live? And then, once the person has been discomfited by the fact that the beliefs do not, then you see we come along with the gospel and explain why it does not and what is the solution to this discomfort that they now have. Thank you. So now, comments, criticisms. No, keep your criticisms to yourself. No, comments. Well, Jay has just given an example of how Schaeffer did this at a situation in L'Abri with a lady who had just been raped on the train ride coming to L'Abri. And he started with her beliefs that went up against reality. And that is, why do you say it's wrong? If your belief is, right, many truths, but all of a sudden you pick out there is a truth. There is an absolute. So now the door is open, isn't it? As long as you deal with people who think that there is many truths as there are minds, then your truth is no better than his truth. Now, some of you will find that very frustrating until you figure out a way, as Schaeffer did. Now, I will take one exception. I don't think you do have to have a brilliant mind myself. Not saying that Schaeffer didn't. I can do it, and I don't have a brilliant mind. I was telling somebody this morning at breakfast, I am definitely not the brightest bulb in the box. But if you think about it, it's very gentle the way you do it. But you have to resist. You have to resist jumping right in and saying everything you know. And now we've got these beliefs. So thanks. That's a great example. Oh, well, I don't know. I might have not done any better than you did, I guess. But I think you have to just, first of all, have to acknowledge that he's got something right. Yeah. That we, not man and woman, yes. Oh, yeah, the question is, if we meet somebody and they don't believe in God and they don't believe in Christian morality, but they still believe that that marriage should be between one woman and one man. And what then might we say to that person? To not talk at them, but with them. Well, I think you just have to go, you need to go other steps. And of course, you don't have that kind of opportunity as you're getting off the train and everybody's going around. But you see, you start with this, what he gives you, as you did. All right? And then explain, and then he gives you an explanation. Now you need to take the next step and say, how does that explain what you've just said you do believe? You just keep taking it another step. In other words, there's always the next step that needs to be taken. It's not the first thing that you hear. It's the second thing, and say, oh, so that's how you explain. I don't mean it that way. But, oh, that's how you explain it. But how does that explain this? And so you just keep, as Schaeffer did with this young lady, you just keep backing them up a little bit. And it takes patience. It takes restraint, because you just want to let them know it, just how wrong they are. So that's something of what I was on a plane, and that's how I find it the most convenient to get from America to Europe. And I was sitting beside a lady, and I was only sitting there because that was my assigned seat. So I just don't want you to think I was looking around for a woman to sit beside. Okay, so, she had a book that she was reading, Ayn Rand, Atlas Shrugged. And she said, have you ever read this? I said, well, no, but I have read some of her books. Oh, she said, what have you read? Oh, I said, I read Objectivist Epistemology. She said, what do you do for a living? Well, now I'm not ashamed that I teach philosophy. And at that time, I was teaching philosophy in a seminary. So I told her. And I thought, well, she's going to hit the call button. She's going to want to change her seat. She'd be willing to stay in the bathroom rather than sit beside this crazy man for an 8-hour flight. But then she said to me, oh, I'm so glad you're sitting beside me. Because she said, I've got a lot of questions. Well, now she was a third-generation Mormon who had turned over Mormonism from the New Age. So as we were talking, this is what she would say. I'm thinking, okay, Lord, how do I get this conversation? And she would say, no, I just think that what's right for you is right for you. And what's true for you is true for you, not me. And we ought not to force ourselves upon other people. Our belief shouldn't be forced upon other people. And no matter what I said, she would come back to the same refrain. And I'm thinking, well, my, now what am I going to do? Well, I asked a question, not really knowing where it would go, but I asked a question out of personal interest to show that she was a human being. And I had an interest in her life to that, to the degree that you can. I said, do you have grandchildren? Oh, now I had to tell you that was the day before smartphones that had 1,000 pictures of the smartest grandchildren in the world and the most beautiful. It's a risky thing to ask. And then she said, yes, I do. And then she volunteered. But she said, it's a very sad thing. And I said, well, why? She said, because my daughter doesn't know how to raise the children. Oh, okay. She said, I go over 2 or 3 times a week to help my grandchildren learn how to live right. And I said, oh, my dear, I'm now very confused. Because I thought you just told me that we shouldn't do that. That we should allow everybody to think what's right for them is right for them, what's right for me is right for me, and we shouldn't interfere. Dead silence. But her response, I've never forgotten. She really got the point. And she said, I can't have it both ways, can I? Right. You can't have it both ways. So you see, that was bringing her into conflict, almost an existential crisis. Which one's going to win out? Is this belief that it's okay to let anybody believe what they want to believe? Well, that was all right if you're talking about the neighbor down the street. It was quite another thing when you're talking about my grandchildren. And now there's a conversation. Because this refrain, it's okay, your truth is your truth, my truth is my truth. Oh, maybe it's not okay. So it's that's what I mean, the sort of thing of just going the next step, keep going the next step. By the way, I would just say that if you're in a witnessing situation, you don't know what to say next, I would not ask, do you have any grandchildren? That might not be the most appropriate. And this is why, in this sort of thing, with Schaeffer and with Lewis, it was never a mechanical thing. It was, I would say, if I hope not to go too far with this, it was spirit-led thing. That you listen carefully, and you're asking the Spirit of God, show me where the crack is. Show me where there's something that I can say. Help me to form the right kind of a question that will get more to what's going on here. That takes, sometimes it just comes to you, and sometimes it doesn't. You just keep struggling. Okay, the question is that Schaeffer was working in the age of modernity. And now we're in a day of postmodernity, whatever that is. Do we think that Schaeffer's approach is as effective today, living with the cultural, intellectual climate that we live in? Is that the basic question? Well, I would say just first answer is yes, because Schaeffer was dealing with existentialism. And if you want to talk about postmodernity, postmodernity's cousin is existentialism. The second cousin is pragmatism. In fact, that's exactly what Richard Rorty called himself, a neo-pragmatist. Pragmatism, that the truth of a claim is how well it works. It's what James would say, what's its cash value? It's true if it works. What's it? Raises a whole lot of questions. Works for who? And what do you mean by work? The other thing, Roderick, that I would say about that is, since both Schaeffer and Lewis did this, so thank you for alerting me. You think so? Good man. Lewis is dealing with atheism. So we're doing a lot with atheism today. So pre-evangelism, since they both did it, I would say it's still valid, and it's not valid. It's still appropriate. I think, and this is nothing to what your question, that is the way you framed it. I think we've done ourselves a great injustice in evangelicalism. We've bought these terms, and it's really crippled in how we deal with individual persons, because we just dump them into this, oh, you're a postmodernist, or you're this, or you're that. I think this whole idea of you're a millennial, or you're a next generation, that if the world wants to do that, fine. But I'm not sure why we and Christians are doing it. I was speaking, matter of fact, I think I can say his name. Yeah, I will, because he was very Dick Kind. I was interviewing Dick one day for a project I was working on. And he said, people come to me and ask, how do you witness to a postmodernist? He said, the way I witness to anybody else. And I think we become trying to be so sensitive. But if we are going to do that, I'm going to say postmodernity, or this ultra-relativism, is precisely where existentialism wouldn't have led. So it worked there, and now I sound like a pragmatist, but it did seem to work well. Skinner says that Francis Schaeffer was the finest personal witness evangelist that he ever witnessed.
And the strength of Schaeffer, I was there in 1962.
He beat you, Jay.
Also around the fireplace. The strength of Schaeffer was that he had a lot of people in the tradition.
And that's right. That's a great point. That the comment is that Schaeffer loved people. Schaeffer loved people and he loved truth. And he believed honest answers for honest questions. And I think, much of our evangelism today has been so manufactured. I'm not want to say be critical of everything, because I shouldn't do that. But I do think we need to be careful that we aren't making our evangelism a very mechanistic thing that we do. Whereas listening into people, having a love for people, love for humanity, and have a deep compassion for the brokenness of humanity. You remember that Paul writes, I forget to whom, I think the Ephesians, but he says, and he lists off all these things, bad things, and he says, and that was some of you before you came to Christ. And we forget our own brokenness? Some have said that Schaeffer would have times of depression. And talking with one person that knew him extremely well, said she often felt that it was because he just saw the terrible brokenness of the world, the brokenness of a human being that had been made in the image of God. We talk about broken, we talk about, we pity them because they're going to hell. Well, yes, that's true, but at a more fundamental level, and this I think was Schaeffer, there was this deep burden for humanity itself because it had been made in the image of God. So I just caution all of us that we don't just get a very neat program. They may work sometimes, but to be listening to individuals and to listen carefully. Yes. Yes, that's a good question. Since we do know that people have different views of the world, how do we talk about objective reality, objective truth? Well, we don't deny that people perceive things differently, right? But I never began a conversation that there's objective truth, because I don't want to defend that. I think I can, but I don't want to defend it. Okay? What I do is simply do it kind of through the back door and let the person see that their beliefs do not measure up to the reality. I'm not going to make an issue over objective. Well, if there's objective truth, there has to be objective reality, that they go together. And then many times it's better just to let people see that without trying to defend it, because they're going to, as they would, dig their heels in, right? But so, these people, a lady who was at I was at a debate, doing a debate at a university, and we had Q&A afterwards, and the lady came up to the microphone, and she said, "I'm an atheist." Okay. Glad you announced that. She said, "I think reality is like this." Now, those of you who have taken a driver's test, you probably have looked through in these little binoculars, and you see a circle, and it's got green dots and red dots. Now, it's a test for colorblindness, right? And there's a number that you can see. And she says, well, some people see the 13, and other people don't see the 13. So you see, reality is in your mind. And I said, yes, but if that's the way of it, what good is the test? The test is trying to determine you either are this or you're not this. So this idea, this is, again, I was just pushing it up against the reality. So we try not to, I think too often we try to stake out our claim early on. let us just work with the person, speaking with them, and just in a compassionate way, and not in a, like they're in the dark, and say, oh, you believe that? No, let's just think about this. Where would this lead us? What would be the next step? What would that lead us to? And be in that kind of a conversation. I don't have to defend it, but I believe it, and I'm just working with it. But I don't have to announce it ahead of time. Yes, try. But again, that's where the Spirit of God. I mean, we pray before we start our day, don't we? I think we do. And it's this idea that I might well understand, God help me, as I'm talking to people, to know what kind of question. I never know ahead of time. I don't go with the 10 questions in my pocket and say, I wonder which question would work well here. No, you just listen well. I'm repeating myself. Jay, I think you had. And just be able to ask good questions. And that comes a lot with practice, I think. We learn because we try to, as I said, we want to tell everybody what we know. And we think we're not being a faithful witness if we don't tell them right up front, Jesus saves. And I don't have to defend my beliefs yet against their beliefs. That just gets into a Donnybrook, a verbal Donnybrook fight. And I'm thinking, I don't have to do that. Now, I'd love to talk, but our time is up, okay? But thank you very much.